Good afternoon. This is Mr. Thurl just checking in, and the purpose of today is to actually go through submitting your prepared DECA project. And by prepared, it's one of these written projects that you've been working on for quite some time. Before we get started, I'll just run you through kind of the process that we're going to touch on today, including tips on the presentation of written content, avoiding these penalty point things, submitting or the final submission process that you must follow this year, and also printing your actual written project. To get started, let's talk about tips on the presentation of written content. The best way I can show you this is to look at a couple previous examples. First off, your paper most likely starts out with the executive summary. Now, the executive summary is super critical to the success of any project, basically because it highlights in a page, or excuse me, 1 to 3 pages, everything that somebody would need to know about your project. The rest they can read further into to learn more about those specifics, but essentially it's the movie trailer of your whole paper. As you look at the presentation of this written content, I want to point out to you a few different things. First off, you'll notice the use of color, borders, lines, and bold-facing type. Along with that, you'll also notice infographics, charts, tables, and different headings. The idea behind this is as you use any of these different components, they help break up or make more apparent what you want the reader to understand from the written presentation of your project. Use of these should only enhance the content or the written portion of it. So for example, as we start to look into this, if I wasn't familiar with the location of this particular business, I could clearly see from the chart over here that it represented in the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So again, if I wasn't from that area, I would understand everything I would need to. Now, the second thing I want to talk about besides the written portion is as you start to look through this, you'll see all those different titles, Roman numerals, lettering, different things like that that occur. Now, it's very critical that you're following the written guidelines for your particular project. So to make sure that we're doing this, I'm going to go out to the DECA website. So if you haven't been here yet, which I doubt you, or I'm sure you have, just type in www.deca.org. Once you get to the site, I'll have you hover on the high school link and then go down to competitive events. What you would do at this point is you would scroll down to find your particular project. I'm just going to pick one for the example of showing you what will be true of all projects. As I get down to business operations, I'm just going to select finance operations. Over to the far right, you'll notice a few different links. You're probably most familiar with the guidelines link. That's the one that you've been using to understand what needs to go into your project. I will visit this shortly, but before I do, I want to point out to you the other links that we'll be referencing during this session. We'll be talking about penalty points and avoiding them. So you'll need this sheet. And then also at the very end, you'll need to print this sheet out, which is the statement of assurances and integrity. All those can be found right next to your particular project. So let's start with the guidelines. When I click on the guidelines page, it shows me everything that I need to do from presentation to written components. So as I look at this, a couple things that I always want to take a look at is how I'm scored. For most of our projects, 60% of our project is based on our written content. So we'll want to make sure that we maximize our points and make sure that we have everything in there that needs to be in there. You'll also want to double check how many pages that you have. In this particular case, it's 20 pages. That's the maximum number. It can be less than that number, but it also has to fall within that range. The most important thing to take a look at is the written entry guidelines. It has everything from the title page all the way through the main content of your your written presentation. One thing just to point out, appendix is an optional section and not needed in this particular piece. So if you have nothing to put in an appendix, then skip that section. Everything else is required and must follow as shown the formatting. What I mean by formatting is you have to have your paper starting out with the executive summary, which can be 1 to 3 pages. You then need to have an introduction, and you need to have all of these different bullets. Whatever your project calls for, you must put in here. Okay, so if it says letter A, description of business or organization, make sure that you copy that exactly and that you have all the Roman numerals along with exactly how it shows these titles. Otherwise, you will be penalized, which we'll talk about in a second. You cannot add any extra sections to what is given here. So again, make sure you follow what is given to you. Next up, we'll go back a screen. And what I want to talk to you guys about is the penalty point checklist. So if you click on that link, you can have this on your screen as I go through. As I go through, I'm going to be talking about this in a small presentation that's included. So follow along as we go. So after you've finished all your project and you have it formatted and it's looking pretty, the biggest thing that people do is forget to double check to make sure that they fit everything into the written guidelines and nothing more or nothing less. So let's make sure we avoid getting penalized because this would come off of our 60%. So for example, if 60 points are present and you make one of these mistakes, it could be 5 points, it could be up to 30 points, which would mean that you would be walking in, if it were 30 points, at a 30 out of 60 on your written presentation, which would probably not allow you to move past the first competition. So here's some things that people are commonly forget or they lose points on. Again, penalty points are those things deducted from the written report because the report did not follow the criteria established on the written entry checklist. So as you're following along with this checklist, I want to point out to you things that are common as well as ways to avoid penalty points. In front of everything when we package this up and send it off to DECA will be the written statement of assurances. This you'll find again that linked right next to your project guidelines as well as the penalty point link that we just clicked on. On the day that you're going to print out your project, what I would ask is that you fill this out and then print it at the same time. If we forget to do this, it's 15 points off. Next up, we'll be putting it into one of the DECA folios, which I'll take care of. I have plenty of these, so you don't need to worry about that. This is another one that you don't really have to worry about it, but don't bring anything in sheet covers. This is a common one that we have to pay attention to. First off, it's 5 points per page. So for example, if you have a 10-page project, which would be some of the integrated marketing campaign events, as well as some of the startup business events, you are limited to 10 pages. So if you were to go to 11 pages, that would be 5 points. Even if it's a mistake by page numbering, you would be penalized 5 points for each extra page. Same goes for our 20-page projects. A key change this year is that the entire entry may be single-spaced, but could also be double-spaced. Spacing is really no longer a requirement or an issue. So however you choose to fit it into that 10 to 20 pages is totally up to you, but make sure that it does not exceed 10 or 20 pages based on your project. This is a pretty common one that people make mistakes on. So for example, the title page and table of contents is not numbered and should be done separately. We'll continue this recording in a separate one in 1 second.